name is Carrie and welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to be talking about my most disappointing reads of 2024. To start off, I only have 7 books out of 100 that I would consider my most disappointing reads. Some of these are books that I don't necessarily think are bad, they just disappointed me in different ways. I think there's definitely an audience for every one of these books, but it was just unfortunately not for me in some cases. So we're going to start off with Pilgrim by Kaveh Akbar. This was disappointing to me because I had previously read Calling a Wolf and really loved that collection. It's one of my favorite poetry collections of all time. And I really enjoyed Kaveh Akbar's style in that first collection, and Pilgrim Bell seems to be very different to me. I honestly noticed a lot of crossover between this and Space Struck by Paige Lewis, who is Kaveh Akbar's life partner. And I'm not really sure, I don't think it's necessarily that Kaveh Akbar is recreating Paige Lewis's style, but I think there's some influence there of trying to be more experimental and trying to look at different themes. There were some poems that I still enjoyed in this, but I felt like it was a little bit too far out there for me. And I don't necessarily think that this collection made sense altogether. Like, some of the placing of poems felt very awkward, and there were a lot that I was really confused by what exactly I was supposed to be taking away from it. And so it was a really big disappointment compared to his first collection for me. And maybe this is just that I haven't read a lot of his poetry outside of collected works. As you can see here, I have Martyr on my shelves, which is Kaveh Akbar's first full-length novel, and it's left me kind of wondering what to expect from a longer work from him, and also any future poetry collections that come out, because I feel now like he's a bit of a wild card. Like, I don't really know how to categorize how I feel about his work. Another poetry collection I want to talk about is Blue Horses by Mary Oliver. I was really surprised that I didn't like this. This was my first exposure to Mary Oliver's work, and I was really disappointed with this. I felt like it was so incredibly pretentious, and I didn't really like the energy of these poems. I thought like they were very basic observations. They used a lot of very basic themes that I think appealed to a large audience but felt very surface level. I really felt no connection to this collection or even individual poems within the collection. So yeah, it was one of my biggest disappointments of the year, and it has left me honestly not wanting to explore more of Mary Oliver's work. The next book is going to be a little controversial because not only is the book itself very beloved, but the author is even more beloved than the book. And that is Betrayed by Emily Henry. This is a romance novel, and it follows this girl who is a writer, and her father died pretty recently and had this secret that gets exposed, and so she goes to this second home that he had with the intention of clearing it out and selling it. And there's also a guy who is a writer who lives next door to this house. He is going through a slump because there's stuff going on in his life. They previously attended, I think it was an MA program together, where they didn't like each other, and so their story kind of starts from there. I really disliked this book. I didn't understand the hype about the book or the author after this because I felt like it was a very mediocre book, typical of the romance genre in terms of a contemporary romance setup and tropes, things like that. I really felt like so much of this story relied on miscommunication and immaturity from the main character, January, and I hate that in romance books. I hate miscommunication tropes. I know sometimes they can be authentic, but oftentimes they just feel very immature, which was the problem that I had here. There were parts of this story that I also got really frustrated with because I think that Emily Henry, and I mean this respectfully, I think that she does not have a lot of life experience with the traumas that certain characters in this story have. And so she didn't know how to write about those traumas in a nuanced way. And I just felt like there was a comfort zone that she was really stuck in here. And I actually found this interesting because I read this book with some friends who had read Emily Henry's books before and some who hadn't. And the ones who had all said that this book felt like an alternative story to another book that she has written. It was the same types of jobs, the same type of storylines, and the same tropes being used. And it just felt like this recreation of another story of hers. And looking at her books, I mean, obviously I haven't read other books by her, but looking at them, they all feel like the same stories over and over again. So again, I feel like there's this comfort zone that Emily Henry stays within, and that is really unappealing to me because my issues with this book were reflected in my other friends' thoughts and feelings about her other books. So this is just an author that I don't think is for me, and unfortunately it was such a big disappointment because Emily Henry is such a hyped up author and I really don't get it. Next, I want to look at Catalina by Karla Cornejo Villavicencio. This is a very weird book because it's essentially almost like a fictionalized account of the author's experience going to an Ivy League school as an undocumented immigrant. I have to say my disappointment with this is because I've already read the author's memoir. It was part memoir, part like social political commentary on undocumented Americans. That's literally the title of the book, The Undocumented Americans. And I found that to have explored the same issues being discussed about in this fictionalized book, obviously with more research and nuance and anecdotal evidence that just worked well for the subject matter. I didn't like it in this format because it just felt like I'd already read these things in a better version before. I think that this could appeal to people who haven't read her memoir before, but I just really couldn't understand, like, what was the point of this after having already read her memoir? That's not to say that I felt like the writing was bad. I still really liked the writing style of this, and I think that this is still a talented author, but this felt like the same story that I'd already read from her before. So not for me, unfortunately. Then I want to talk about Meet Me at the Lake by Carley Fortune. This is the story of a guy and a girl who, I can't remember how many years, I think it's like 10 years before this story starts, met and had this like one special day together. And they promise that a year later they will meet at this like lake that's in the girl's hometown. She shows up, he doesn't. And so almost a decade later, you're following like what happens when they meet again. I have to say, this is my second of Carley Fortune's book, and I feel like I had the same issues with this that I did with the first book. In this book, the only real difference there was that this relied much more on miscommunication, which is my least favorite trope in romance books. And the miscommunication in this was so frustrating to me because it could have been like one sentence that resolved the problems in this, and that just didn't happen for like 200 pages. In other books by Carley Fortune, I always have issues where I seem to be much more invested in the side characters and background stories of certain things instead of the main storyline, and this was also my issue here. I cared much more about the like resort and what was going to happen with that, and the female main character's relationship with her mother, who has recently passed away, than I did with the romance elements of the story. And I felt like all of those issues just get pushed to the side and the romance plot takes over. But it's not a romance where I felt like there were sparks that flew there or the main characters made sense together, especially with where they're at in the time period that they meet again, because they just felt like very different people with very different goals in life. It just didn't make sense to me. I felt like, what was really the point of this story? Because I think it could have been more impactful if the story actually hadn't been a romance. Unfortunately, that's not what it was, and so it ended up being incredibly disappointing for me. And I really struggle with Carley Fortune because in theory, her books sound so interesting to me, but in practice, I'm not really enjoying them. The only other book of hers that I would consider reading is the book about Charlie from Every Summer After, just because I liked that character. Again, I really like the side characters in this like world that she's built, but I don't really care for the main characters. And I feel like that's a bad pattern to keep having. The next book was a little bit out of my comfort zone because it was a seasonal read, and I'm not a big seasonal reader. I actually tend to read seasonal books like outside of the season they're set in. I don't know why, but this is a pattern I have developed over time. I was really interested in this one though because it is co-authored by one of my favorite authors of all time. So that is 3 Holidays and a Wedding by Uzma Jalaluddin and Marissa Stapley. I thought this was so fascinating because it's a story about how Ramadan, technically Eid, Hanukkah, and Christmas are all happening at the same time of year. And I thought that was an interesting premise. There's this flight of people that gets rerouted to this area, and they all have to spend these 3 holidays together. In execution, it wasn't very well done. I felt like there was a big disparity between the chapters, and I'm assuming based on like the background of the authors that each author wrote one of the characters, and you could tell there was big differences in writing, in like development of characters and plot lines across the chapters, which was unfortunate because there are crossover between these characters and storylines, but it just felt very uneven. Also, this book felt so incredibly much like a Hallmark movie in like the worst of ways. Everything was very oversimplified, things were very easily wrapped up. There's like all this like magical time of year thing that just logically didn't make sense. Like there was a lot of suspension of belief required. And so yeah, it was really disappointing to me. It's not going to stop me from reading Uzma Jalaluddin's works in the future, but I just don't think that this was particularly well executed as a co-author venture. Apologies, I had a delivery that came as I was filming, so I'm hoping this is still kind of the same setup. The last book I want to talk about is a disappointing sequel, and this is Bookshops and Bonedust by Travis Baldree. Now, I still really liked this book. I thought it was entertaining, but I didn't love it as much as Legends and Lattes. To be honest, I think the order these books came out in added to this, because since we know that Bookshops and Bonedust is technically a prequel to Legends and Lattes, the stakes are much lower. We know that Viv is going to be in another book, and a lot of the characters being introduced, we know that at least some of them also make an appearance in the first book. I understand now that Travis Baldree is, in the second Legends and Lattes book, reintroducing those characters from Bookshops and Bonedust. But again, the order of it is just so weird to me, and I didn't feel like I could be fully invested in this story because there were parts that were funny or entertaining, but it just didn't grip me in the same way. And Legends and Lattes was more about this cozy atmosphere, Viv finding a sense of community. And this was much more about like magic systems in the world and like more suspenseful or like adventurous than Legends and Lattes. And again, that just doesn't really successfully build anticipation because we know how it ends in a sense already. I think this is one where like years from now, I would like to reread the series with Bookshops and Bonedust first, and then Legends and Lattes and the second Legends and Lattes book. But because I read Legends and Lattes fairly recently and remember all of the details of it, that just hindered my experience with this book. So those are my most disappointing reads of 2024. Please let me know if you've read any of these books in the comments down below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on them. Or if you want to discuss your most disappointing read, I'd also love to hear about that as well. Thank you so much for watching this video and happy reading. Bye!